The vintage grandfather clock in the grand foyer of the Winterbourne estate had just struck 2 in the morning. The heavy bronze chimes vibrated through the climate-controlled air as Eleanor descended the sweeping marble staircase for the very last time. Behind her, a single private security guard carried a modest leather travel trunk. She wore a heavy midnight blue designer coat over a simple black dress, her long dark hair loose and unpinned, cascading over her shoulders like shadows. She had not summoned her personal stylists. She had not summoned the estate staff. The soft ambient lighting lining the vast vaulted walls threw her elongated shadow across the cold Italian marble floor. The sprawling mega mansion around her was entombed in absolute silence. It was the crushing stillness of a billion-dollar empire that did not yet realize its heart was being surgically removed. She had packed her belongings in less than an hour. She had taken no designer jewelry, no stock certificates, and none of the black cards linking her to the Valerius fortune. Upstairs, resting upon a velvet cushion in her master dressing room, was the Valerius diamond. It was a suffocating, magnificent platinum collar of flawless stones that served as the unofficial crown of the dynasty matriarch. She had taken it off, placed it down under the vanity lights, and walked away. Her movements were driven by a terrifying, absolute calm. It was not the composed poise of a corporate diplomat, but the chilling serenity of a woman who had already died a silent emotional death and was simply commanding her body to leave the tomb. The crisp, isolated strikes of her sharp heels echoed upward into the darkness. She heard him before she saw him. His heavy footfall stepped out from the shadows of the executive wing, but she did not slow her pace. "Where do you think you're going?" Alaric asked. Eleanor reached the bottom of the grand staircase and moved across the cavernous foyer toward the heavy security doors. Away from a man who looked his wife in the eye and told her he never loved her. "Eleanor, I did not mean—" "You meant it." She stopped then. Her pale hand rested against the brushed steel handle of the massive door, and she turned to look back at him. Alaric Valerius, 32 years old, CEO of Valerius Holdings, standing on the marble steps of his own architectural stronghold. He wore only a loose-tailored shirt and dark trousers, his face pale in the moonlight, streaming through the floor to ceiling armored windows. The expression on his face was one she had never witnessed in their 7 years of marriage. It was not his boardroom fury. It was not the arrogant indignation of a titan of industry. It was the devastating realization of a man who had spoken a profound truth and was only just now feeling the edge of the blade he had blindly swung. "I watched your eyes when you said it," Eleanor said, her voice echoing softly but sharply in the vast space. There was no hesitation. "You did not speak in anger. You chose those words with the full, calculated knowledge of what they meant. And now, Alaric, I'm asking you to rule in the ruin of them. Eleanor, you cannot simply leave. You are the face of this family. You said you never loved me." She repeated his words back to him without a single tremor in her throat. She spoke them with the clinical precision of a federal judge reading a final sentence. "Never. That word is absolute, Alaric. It consumes tonight. It consumes the hostile takeover of the northern assets last year. It consumes the dawn our daughter, Genevieve, was born. And it consumes the day I signed the marriage registry and bound my family legacy to yours. Every year of it, every morning of it, you chose the word never." She pushed the heavy steel handle. The door swung open and the brutal biting wind of the New York winter rushed into the foyer, swirling the hem of her heavy coat. Outside, a solitary unmarked black SUV waited on the snowy driveway. She had sent a trusted driver to prepare it an hour ago because she had known the very second the words left his mouth that she would not see the sun rise over the Winterbourne estate again. "Do not send your security detail after me," she said, pulling her collar up against the cold. "Genevieve remains under the protection of Clara. She will not be dragged from her bed at 2 in the morning, simply because her father discovered he does not love her mother. You may explain my absence to the board of directors tomorrow, in whatever manner protects your fragile pride." "I did not say I do not value you." Alaric started taking a desperate step down the marble stairs. "You said you never loved me." Eleanor repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow cut clean through the howling wind. "And that is a sentence I cannot unhear." "May God bless your empire, Alaric." She stepped out into the snow. The heavy doors clicked shut behind her with an electronic lock, the sound reverberating like a gunshot through the hollow halls. Alaric stood frozen listening as the heavy tires ground against the frost-covered gravel, the sound fading into the winter winds until there was nothing left but the oppressive, suffocating silence of his own fortress. Sterling, the chief operating officer and oldest confidant of the Valeris family, found Alaric still standing in the freezing draft of the foyer at 4 in the morning. The elderly executive had dressed hastily, holding a glowing tablet in his hand. He did not speak immediately. He stood beside his boss, looking through the tinted glass panes at the dark, empty driveway, where the tire tracks were already being buried by the falling snow. Sir Sterling said softly. She left. Alaric said, his voice entirely hollow. Yes, sir. Alaric did not blink. I told her I never loved her. Sterling, a man who had navigated decades of corporate warfare and survived 3 generations of Valerius men, remained perfectly still. The ambient light flickered across his weathered face. Did you mean it, Alaric? Alaric answered without looking away from the snow. Yes. The older man let out a long, slow breath. He looked out at the driveway for another moment before turning back to the CEO. Then, I believe you do not understand the language you speak, Sterling said quietly. Because I have served this company for 40 years. And the man I watched sit beside Eleanor in the executive boardroom every morning was a man who loved his wife. Sterling locked his tablet, bowed his head respectfully, and retreated into the shadows of the estate, leaving the titan of the financial world standing alone in the cold, watching the tracks of the only woman who ever grounded him disappear into the night. The fracture had begun, as tragedies often do, for a matter of seemingly trivial consequence. It was late November, the height of the fiscal year-end. There had been a massive charity gala scheduled to honor the international investors of the eastern branches. Alaric had commanded his assistant to cancel his appearance with merely 3 hours of notice, citing an urgent hostile acquisition that required his undivided attention. He had left Eleanor to face the sudden public relations fallout entirely alone. She had managed it as she managed the entire dynasty's social architecture. She had personally smiled for the cameras, drafted elegant apologies to the insulted billionaires, sent bottles of impossibly rare vintage wine to their penthouses, and smoothed over the financial tension with a devastating grace that belonged entirely to her. She had not scolded him that evening. She had not complained the following morning. She had spent 7 years smoothing the jagged edges of his ruthless ambition without ever demanding a parade for her efforts. And then on a Tuesday night, Alaric returned to his home office near midnight. He found Eleanor still sitting at the massive mahogany desk, the light of a single desk lamp catching the exhausted shadows beneath her dark eyes. She was meticulously reviewing the charitable foundation ledgers, a tedious monumental task he had casually asked her to oversee. As he walked in, tossing his suit jacket onto a leather chair, he said, without even looking at her, "You can leave the numbers for the accounting department tomorrow. It is late." Something in the room shifted. The air grew suddenly terribly heavy. Eleanor went entirely still. She placed her designer pen down on the pristine documents. "Alaric," she said softly. He paused near the wet bar, pouring a glass of scotch, finally looking at her. "Do you love me?" She had never asked him that question, not once in 7 years. Not on the night of their high society wedding, when she had stood trembling in her heavy custom gown beneath the flash of paparazzi cameras. Not on the terrifying dawn, when she had labored for 2 days in the private wing of the hospital to bring Genevieve into the world, and he had stood by the window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline while she bled. She had never asked because Vivian, her mother, and the ruthless matriarch of the Rosemont family had taught her at 16 that a powerful man's affection was a strategic vulnerability. "Do not beg for what should be given freely," her mother had said. Eleanor had built her entire marriage on the quiet belief that unyielding devotion and absolute loyalty would eventually blossom into love. Alaric stood holding his crystal glass. He looked at her, considering the question with the same cold, analytical seriousness he applied to corporate mergers. She watched his face. She watched him weigh the variables, search his own heavily guarded heart, and she saw the exact terrifying second. He arrived at his conclusion. No, he said, his voice steady. "I do not believe I do. Not in the way the word is meant." Eleanor did not flinch. Her hands remained perfectly still on the edge of the mahogany desk. "And what way is the word meant, Alaric?" "What my parents shared," he said, his eyes darkening with old ghosts. "That was love. It was a chaotic, burning thing. It consumed them both. The scandal ruined my mother, and my father lost his mind to it. He stopped looking down at the amber liquid in his glass. What I feel for you is something else. It is profound admiration. It is the deepest regard. I rely on you completely to hold this family together. But I have never... He stopped again, the silence stretching tight. I never loved you. I should not have let you believe otherwise. And there it was, the word never. She had heard it strike the floor of the office like a shattered mirror. She sat there in the dim light, feeling the devastation ripple backward through time. It poisoned their 7 years together. It poisoned the morning at the altar. It poisoned the night Genevieve was born, when he had stayed in the room simply because she had desperately asked him not to leave. All of it, every quiet moment of solace retroactively annihilated by a single syllable. She had stood up, smoothed the expensive fabric of her skirt, walked up the grand staircase, and packed her trunk in less than an hour. As the black SUV carried her further into the frozen night, she stared out the tinted window at the blurring city lights. On their wedding night, Eleanor had been terrified. She had sat on the edge of the enormous bed, her hands shaking so violently she could not unclasp her diamond necklace. Alaric had sat beside her, taken her trembling hands, placed them flat against his chest over his own racing heart, and held them there. My heart is frantic too, he had whispered, and she had laughed, a startled, genuine laugh that broke the terror. She had cherished that memory like a hidden jewel for 7 years. But as she left the Winterbourne estate behind her, posture straightening in the leather seat of the car, she realized that memory belonged only to him now. He would have to live with it. He would have to turn it over in his hands every single night in his massive empty fortress, like a stolen artifact he could no longer afford to keep. He began to walk the sprawling estate in the days that followed. He did not walk with the purposeful stride of a billionaire inspecting his domain. He walked like a ghost haunting his own halls. For 7 years, Alaric Valerius had known every security protocol, every architectural blueprint, every echoing chamber of the Winterbourne estate. He had conquered rival corporations and negotiated hostile takeovers that reshaped the global market from the head of his massive dining table. Yet he realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that he had never truly looked at the fortress he ruled. Now the silence of the massive stone and glass mansion was deafening. It was not merely the absence of noise, it was the absolute absence of life. He noticed it first on Monday morning in the executive boardroom on the 50th floor of the Valerius Tower in Manhattan. When the heavy frosted glass doors swung open and the elite board of directors took their seats, the custom leather chair to Alaric's immediate right remained empty. For 7 years, Eleanor had sat there. She was officially listed as a senior consultant, but everyone in the room knew her true power. She had never spoken out of turn, but she had commanded the room with the subtle, terrifying grace of a true queen of industry. When a senior vice president grew too arrogant, she would simply shift her posture, the heavy silk of her designer blouse, making a distinct rushing sound against the silence, and the room would immediately quiet down. When a high-stakes negotiation stalled, she would softly tap her diamond-encrusted wedding band against the mahogany table, signaling a shift in strategy. It was a secret language they had built together, a language he thought belonged to him. Now there were no rustling silks. There was no gentle tapping of diamonds against wood. The board members bickered over supply chain, logistics, and offshore accounts. Their voices were grating and loud, echoing off the high glass walls. Men who used to measure their words carefully in Eleanor's presence were now posturing like feral dogs fighting over scraps. Alaric sat at the head of the table, his custom-tailored suit feeling strangely heavy, and felt a profound suffocating exhaustion wash over him. He looked down at the physical portfolios piled before him. There were over 40 legal documents awaiting his signature. He opened the first 3 and realized with a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck that he had never actually read beyond the executive summary of any major contract in his entire tenure as CEO. Eleanor had read them all. She had spent countless nights awake summarizing the legal jargon, negotiating the hidden liability clauses with their army of corporate lawyers, and merely presenting him with the final page to sign. She had been his shield. She had been the invisible armor that allowed him to play the fearless visionary, because she was always there to handle the brutal, microscopic reality of the consequences. He abruptly stood up in the middle of a heated argument between his CFO and the head of acquisitions. The room fell into a shocked silence. "Figure it out yourselves," Alaric said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual commanding resonance. I want a cohesive strategy on my desk by tomorrow morning. If you cannot provide one, I will find a board that can." He walked out of the boardroom without waiting for a response, ignoring the frantic whispers that erupted the second the glass doors closed behind him. He retreated to his private corner office. The grand room overlooking the sprawling concrete grid of the city felt entirely hollow. There were 3 tall crystal vases lined up perfectly along the massive windowsill, filled with dried winter flora. He had never noticed them before. He did not know who placed them there, though he knew, with a crushing certainty, it must have been her. He walked over to his massive desk and opened the lower drawer. There, organized in pristine color, coded files with Eleanor's elegant, sweeping handwriting on the tabs were the global charitable allocation schedules for the next 3 quarters. She had calculated the tax deductions, mapped out the press release strategies, and secured the gala venues. She had been meticulously planning for a future she knew she might not be part of. She was always planning for the Empire's survival. Even while he was breaking her heart, in their home study she had been securing his legacy. He stood in the center of the silent office, the hum of the city traffic muffled by the reinforced glass. The realization settled upon his shoulders, heavier than any financial loss he had ever suffered. He had not simply lost a wife in a moment of arrogant honesty. The Empire had lost its central architect, and the foundation was already beginning to crack. Late that evening, Sterling entered the private office without knocking. The elderly chief operating officer carried a single encrypted tablet, his expression grim. The city outside was dark, illuminated only by the neon grid of the skyline. Alaric was still sitting in his chair, staring blankly at the unread contracts on his desk. "The European investors are making inquiries," Sterling said, placing the tablet firmly on the desk. "They noticed her absence at the charity gala last week. They noticed her empty chair today. Rumors are already bleeding into the financial sector. Let them rumor," Alaric said, rubbing his exhausted eyes. "Valerius Holdings does not answer to gossip." Sterling leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the desk. His tone shifted, dropping the formal deference of an employee and taking on the sharp authority of a man who had known Alaric since he was a child. "This is not gossip about a celebrity affair, Alaric. This is structural panic. The investors do not just trust you, they trust the ecosystem you built, and Eleanor was the climate control of that ecosystem. She is the reason the Eastern subsidiaries agreed to the merger last year. She is the reason the federal regulators look favorably upon our foundation. You are the ruthless blade of this company, yes, but she was the hand that guided it, and everyone in the upper echelons knows it." Alaric's jaw tightened. "Are you telling me I am incompetent without my wife? I am telling you that you are standing on a glass floor, and you just shattered the only pillar holding it up." Sterling fired back, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "She made you tolerable to the board. She made you human to the public. You think you built this dynasty alone because she was graceful enough to let you stand in the spotlight." Sterling paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the broken titan sitting before him. "I warned you the night she left," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I told you that you did not understand the language you were speaking. You pride yourself on raw logic, Alaric. You weigh every asset, but you completely miscalculated the value of unconditional loyalty. You looked at a woman who bled for your empire for 7 years, and you told her she meant nothing to your heart." "I did not say she meant nothing. I said I did not love her the way my parents loved." "Your parents burned their legacy to the ground in a psychotic, jealous rage," Sterling said, his voice laced with pure disgust. "If that is your metric for love, then you are a fool. Eleanor gave you stability. She gave you absolute devotion. She asked for nothing but the basic dignity of being valued, and you stripped her of it because you were chasing a ghost." Alaric stared at the older man, his chest tight, unable to form a coherent defense. Because there was no defense. Every word Sterling spoke was a brutal, undeniable fact. "Fix this," Alaric Sterling commanded, stepping back from the desk, "before the board realizes the king is deaf-blind and bleeding out." Sterling turned and walked out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut. Alaric sat alone in the dim light of the towering skyscraper. He reached out and picked up the pristine file Eleanor had left behind. He traced the elegant curve of her handwriting with a trembling finger. He had spent his entire adult life mitigating risk, predicting market crashes, and outsmarting billionaires. Yet he had engineered his own total destruction with a single arrogant sentence. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He opened her contact. He stared at the glowing screen for a long time, the cursor blinking over the empty message box. He wanted to type a command. He wanted to demand she return. He wanted to beg, but he locked the screen and set the phone down. A woman like Eleanor did not return for a corporate crisis. She did not return for a command. And she certainly would not return for a man who had not yet realized exactly what he was apologizing for. 7 days after her departure, Alaric could no longer withstand the suffocating silence of his own life. He cancelled a multi-billion-dollar acquisition meeting, bypassed his entire security detail, and took the keys to his vintage Aston Martin. He drove himself out of Manhattan, heading north into the biting winter storm toward the Hudson Valley. He was driving toward the Rosemont estate, the ancestral compound of Eleanor's family, hidden deep within hundreds of acres of frozen private woodland. He did not have his assistant call ahead. He did not draft an elegant email. He had foolishly believed with the inherent arrogance of a man who bent the financial world to his will on a daily basis, that if he arrived in person cloaked in his status and his wealth, something could be negotiated. He thought of it as a breached contract. He would offer concessions. He would apologize for the harshness of his delivery. He would bring his wife home. He was catastrophically wrong. The heavy, wrought iron and security gates of the Rosemont compound were locked tight. They stood 20 feet high, flanked by stone pillars that had survived for over a century. Beyond the gates, the sweeping snow-covered driveway led up to the massive Gothic Revival mansion, its dark windows, staring down at him like judgmental eyes. Alaric stepped out of his car into the freezing wind. He pressed the intercom button on the stone pillar. Open the gates, he commanded, his breath pluming in the frigid air. This is Alaric Valerius. I'm here for my wife. There was a long static pause. Then the intercom clicked off without a single word of response. Alaric frowned, his jaw tightening. He reached out to press the button again, preparing to unleash the full terrifying weight of his temper on whatever security guard was manning the booth. But before his finger could touch the metal, a figure emerged from the shadow of the estate's sprawling portico and began to walk slowly down the long driveway toward the gates. It was not Eleanor, it was Vivian. Vivian Rosemont was 73 years old, wrapped tightly in a sweeping coat of black sable fur, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon. She had spent over 4 decades managing one of the oldest and most ruthless legacy fortunes in the country, navigating corporate assassinations, political scandals, and economic crashes with the exact same lethal efficiency her daughter had brought to the Valerius Empire. She did not stop at the gatehouse. She walked right up to the wrought iron bars, the snow crunching beneath her designer boots. She looked through the dark metal at the billionaire CEO standing on the outside. Her gaze possessed the absolute freezing contempt of a woman who had already weighed a man's soul and found it violently lacking. The gates remained closed. Alaric Vivian's voice cut through the howling wind, carrying perfectly through the iron bars. Her tone was not raised. It was a terrifying, cultured murmur. Alaric pulled his dark wool coat tighter against the cold, stepping closer to the gate. I am not here to play old money power games, Vivian. I demand entry. I am her husband, and I wish to see my wife. 10 minutes of her time. That is all I ask. You do not possess the authority or the capital to demand 10 seconds of her time on my property. Vivian replied, her voice steady and lethal. She stepped closer to the cold metal, her dark eyes piercing him. My daughter arrived at these gates at dawn a week ago, Vivian continued. She was sitting in the back of a black SUV, shivering in a thin designer coat over a black dress. She brought one leather trunk, Alaric. After 7 years of managing your volatile empire, she left with one single trunk. Her hair was tangled and loose because she did not even have the presence of mind to pin it before she fled your house. Alaric gripped the cold iron bars of the gate, his knuckles turning white. I did not force her out. I did not ask her to leave. You did worse. Vivian sneered, the disgust finally bleeding into her elegant voice. I took her in from the cold. I ordered the staff away. I personally brought her hot tea in my own sitting room, and I sat with her trembling body until the sheer exhaustion finally claimed her. Do you know what she said to me before she fell asleep, Alaric? He stared at the matriarch, his chest aching with a sudden sharp dread. What? Nothing, Vivian said the word, dropping like a stone onto frozen glass. She did not weep. She did not scream. She did not curse your name. She just sat on the edge of the antique sofa and stared at the fireplace as if the entire world had ended and she was the only casualty. The older woman paused, the winter wind whipping the dark fur of her coat around her regal frame. I taught her that, Vivian said, her voice dropping into something profoundly dangerous and soft. I taught her that a woman in our position does not beg. I taught her that requiring emotional validation from a ruthless man was a vulnerability that would only lead to public ruin. I spent 3 decades wondering if that was cruel advice to give a child. But she followed it. She asked you for nothing for 7 years. She guarded your back, she covered your flaws, and she built your reputation. And on the one night she asked you a single, desperately human question, you struck her down with your arrogant cruelty. Vivian, please, Alaric choked out the reality of what he had broken, finally, shattering his corporate armor. Let me speak to her. I can fix this. I can explain. You are not a cruel tyrant, Alaric. I have always known that Vivian interrupted, her eyes as cold as polished obsidian. But fools are often far more dangerous than tyrants, and fools do not deserve my daughter. She reached through the bars not to touch him, but to point a single leather-gloved finger directly at his chest. Whatever you said to her, to break her, you must say the exact opposite to fix it, Vivian said. You cannot buy your way out of this with a foundation, donation, or a diamond necklace. You cannot negotiate a settlement for a shattered heart. Whether a man of your profound emotional blindness is capable of actual redemption is not my concern. I am her mother, and my only job now is to ensure you never have the opportunity to make her look at a wall with those dead eyes ever again. Vivian stepped back from the gate. Drive back to your empty glass tower, Alaric, she commanded softly, because there's nothing for you here. She turned her back on him and began the long walk up the snow-covered driveway. She did not look back once. The heavy iron gates remained sealed, shut, an impenetrable barrier of old money and protective rage. Alaric stood on the side of the freezing highway for a long time. He watched the dark silhouette of the matriarch disappear into the massive estate. The wind howled through the bare branches of the ancient trees, chilling him to the bone. He had conquered international markets. He had crushed hostile competitors and orchestrated the downfalls of men twice his age. He had thought himself untouchable, but he had never felt as utterly defeated, as completely powerless as he did standing outside the locked gates of Rosemont. He finally turned and walked back to his Aston Martin. He sat in the driver's seat, the leather freezing against his back. He did not start the engine immediately. He gripped the steering wheel, resting his forehead against the cold leather, and closed his eyes. The image of Eleanor sitting in her mother's house, staring blankly at a fire, not shedding a single tear, burned itself into his mind. It was a specific kind of agony. If she had screamed, if she had cried, it would have meant there was still a living nerve left to salvage. But her silence, her devastating unbroken composure in the face of total betrayal, meant that the damage was foundational. He had not just hurt his wife. He had taken a woman of immense pride and elegance, a woman who held the world together with her bare hands, and he had hollowed her out. He turned the key in the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life, a stark contrast to the dead silence inside his chest. As he drove back toward the Manhattan skyline, the towering skyscrapers no longer looked like monuments to his success. They looked like massive, beautiful gravestones marking the site where he had buried the only real thing he had ever possessed. 3 days passed since the gates of Rosemont were shut in his face. For 3 days, the CEO of Valera's Holdings barely slept, barely ate, and barely functioned. The sprawling Winterbourne estate, usually a hub of meticulously scheduled activity, had become a mausoleum of quiet footsteps and averted eyes. The estate staff moved through the massive corridors, like ghosts terrified of triggering the dark, simmering volatility of their employer. Alaric spent his evenings locked inside his home office, staring at financial projections that suddenly looked like meaningless numbers on a screen. He poured expensive scotch into crystal glasses and left them untouched on the mahogany desk. He was a man who had spent his entire life quantifying value, and he was currently suffocating under the incalculable weight of a loss he had engineered himself. On the 4th afternoon, the heavy oak doors of his study opened. He did not look up from the glowing screen of his laptop, his jaw tight with exhaustion. I said I did not want to be disturbed. Alaric snapped, expecting to see one of his executive assistants or a senior security detail. It was Clara. Clara was a highly educated, fiercely protective childcare specialist hired from London the month Genevieve was born. She was a woman of impeccable standards who navigated the chaotic schedules of the billionaire class with military precision. She stepped into the dim climate-controlled study carrying a large, expensive leather art portfolio pressed tightly against her chest. Her expression was tight with an anxiety she was desperately trying to mask beneath professional protocol. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. Valerius," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly, breaking the oppressive silence of the room. "But Genevieve has been drawing. She has been very busy this past week in the nursery." Alaric dragged a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble along his jawline. "Leave them on the side table, Clara. I will look at them and praise her work when I visit her wing this evening," Mr. Valerius, Clara said. She did not move toward the side table. She stood firmly in the center of the Persian rug. "I believe you need to look at them now. Please." Alaric frowned. He finally pulled his gaze away from the monitor and looked at the nanny. Clara was not a woman prone to emotional exaggeration. If she was interrupting his isolated spiral, there was a profound reason for it. He closed his laptop with a soft click and gestured for her to approach the desk. Clara laid the heavy leather portfolio on the polished mahogany and unzipped it with shaking hands. There were 14 drawings inside on thick, expensive watercolor paper. Genevieve was only 5 years old. Her art was bold, wildly unrefined, utilizing whatever expensive colored markers and inks she could pilfer from the estate's private art tutor. The figures were large with exaggerated features and emphatic, almost violent strokes of color that filled the heavy pages. Alaric pulled the stack of thick parchment sheets toward him, examining them one by one under the glow of the brass desk lamp. In 9 of the drawings, the figures were clearly identifiable. There was a tall man always drawn in sharp strokes of dark blue and black representing Alaric in his custom-tailored suits. Beside him was a woman with long dark hair, rendered in the specific vibrant shade of emerald green that Genevieve always associated with Eleanor's favorite designer coats. In every single one of those 9 drawings, the blue figure of the father was smiling. It was a grand sweeping curve of a mouth drawn in thick ink. He was smiling at the mother, smiling at the child, smiling as they stood by the estate's private lake or the helipad. Then Alaric reached the remaining 5 drawings at the bottom of the stack. These were drawn in the last few days after the black SUV had taken Eleanor away in the middle of the night. In these 5 pictures, the vibrant green figure of the mother was entirely missing. It was only the tall man in dark blue standing alone in massive empty rooms constructed of harsh black lines. Alaric's breath caught sharply in his throat. The temperature in the study seemed to plummet. In the drawings where Eleanor was absent, the man in blue had no mouth. Genevieve had drawn his eyes. She had drawn his dark hair, his broad shoulders, and the sharp lapels of his business suits. But the face was blank beneath the nose. A silent, faceless entity wandering through a hollow, oversized house. A man entirely incapable of speaking, incapable of smiling violently, stripped of his voice and his joy the moment the green figure vanished from the page. Clara stood quietly beside the massive desk, her hands folded tightly in front of her, watching the billionaire's hands begin to tremble as he held the heavy watercolor paper. "She draws you smiling, Mr. Valerius," the nanny whispered carefully, her British accent clipping the edges of the quiet room. "Only in the portraits, where her mother is present. I noticed you have no expression, no mouth at all in the others. I thought, as her father, you should see exactly how she perceives the change in this house." Alaric could not look away from the faceless, blue figure. It was a brutal, innocent, terrifying reflection of his own soul. It bypassed every layer of corporate defense, every rationalization he had constructed in his mind, and struck him directly in the chest. He picked up one specific drawing from the pile of 9. It depicted 2 figures standing beside the massive glass windows of the estate's indoor pool. It was a chaotic wash of blue ink and green crayon, and both the man and the woman possessed massive joyous smiles. "Did I smile, Clara?" Alaric asked, his voice barely a rasp, his throat tightening to the point of pain. "When we walked through the house. I am just an employee, sir. It is not my place to evaluate your marriage." "Answer me, Clara," Alaric commanded, his voice creaking, entirely devoid of his usual authority. "You have watched us for years. You live in this house. Did I smile?" Clara looked at the crude drawing on the desk, then looked down at the broken titan of industry. "You only ever smiled when Eleanor was speaking," Sir Clara said, delivering the truth with surgical mercy. "We all knew it. The security team knew it. The kitchen staff knew it. This massive estate was only ever warm when she was in the room. When she left for a business trip, you became a machine. When she returned, you became a man. Genevieve is 5 years old, but children feel the temperature of a room long before they understand the words being spoken in it. She knows her father has lost his voice because the only person he ever truly spoke to is gone. Clara reached out gently, closing the leather flap of the portfolio over the drawings. She stepped back from the desk. "I will prepare Genevieve for her bath, Mr. Valerius. Have a good evening." She turned and quietly withdrew from the study, her soft footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving the billionaire completely alone. Alaric sat paralyzed in his leather executive chair. He stared at the closed leather portfolio. He raised his hands and pressed the heels of his palms hard against his eyes, trying to block out the image of the faceless man in blue, but it was burned into the back of his eyelids. His chest heaved. A sharp physical pain radiated outward from his ribs. He had told Eleanor he never loved her. He had convinced himself that his reliance on her was purely structural, convenient arrangement for managing his high-stressed life. But a 5-year-old child with a box of cheap markers had seen through a lie that a man with a genius-level IQ had spent 7 years building. He had not just driven away his wife, he had driven away the only part of himself that was actually human. Eleanor was not just the architect of his social empire, she was the architect of his soul. She was the only reason his daughter recognized him as a living, breathing father instead of a ghost haunting a billion-dollar fortress. Alaric leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood of the desk and buried his face in his hands. The silence of the Winterbourne estate pressed down on him, crushing and absolute. He let out a ragged, broken breath that echoed in the empty room. It was the sound of a man who owned half of Manhattan, finally realizing that he was completely, utterly bankrupt. The crisis descended upon the Winterbourne estate, not with the dramatic crash of a hostile corporate takeover, but with the quiet, terrifying creep of a viral respiratory infection. It began on a bleak Monday morning. Genevieve complained of a deep chill that the massive estate's climate control systems could not banish. By Tuesday evening, a violent fever had taken hold. Her small body burned beneath the heavy silk sheets of her custom bed. Her skin flushed and damp, her breathing reduced to a shallow, ragged rasp that echoed horribly through the sprawling private nursery wing. Alaric spared no expense. He immediately summoned the chief of pediatrics from a top Manhattan private hospital, flying the medical team to the estate via helicopter. They transformed the nursery into a state-of-the-art intensive care unit. IV monitors beeped in the quiet room, and high-grade humidifiers pumped sterilized mist into the air. The elite medical team administered broad-spectrum antibiotics and constant fever reducers, but the brutal infection violently refused to break. At dawn on Wednesday, as the child's temperature spiked dangerously near 104 degrees, Clara made an executive decision. She bypassed the billionaire CEO entirely, walked into an empty hallway, and called the private line of the Rosemont estate. Eleanor arrived less than 40 minutes later. She did not come in a black SUV. The rhythmic, deafening thud of a twin-engine private helicopter shattered the quiet morning landing directly on the estate's sprawling south lawn. Eleanor did not wait for the security team to open the cabin door. She practically threw herself from the aircraft before the blades had fully slowed her dark designer trench coat, whipping violently in the downdraft. Her face was pale with a terrifying maternal focus that stripped away every ounce of her usual diplomatic composure. She tore through the glass doors of the grand foyer, her sharp heels clicking like gunfire over the marble entirely, ignoring the shocked bows of the estate staff and the frantic updates of the security detail. Alaric was standing in the doorway of the medical wing when she appeared at the end of the long corridor. He looked up, his face gaunt from 2 days without sleep, his custom dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his tie discarded somewhere in the study. They did not speak. Eleanor walked right past him without breaking her stride, without offering him a single glance. She was entirely untouchable, surrounded by a freezing aura of pure intent. She pushed past the team of highly paid doctors and dropped to her knees beside the massive bed, pressing her bare face against her daughter's burning forehead. The air in the room thick with the scent of clinical antiseptic, and the faint, elegant trace of Eleanor's signature perfume crystallized the moment she took control. The chasm between the estranged husband and wife was an ocean of unspoken grief, but the dying child in the bed demanded a bridge, and so they built one entirely out of necessity. They worked the sick room for the next 24 hours in a suffocating, agonizing proximity. They did not communicate directly. Instead, they passed commands and medical updates through the chief physician, treating the exhausted doctor as a diplomatic envoy between two warring nations. Tell him to authorize the secondary steroid push. Her breathing is becoming too shallow. Eleanor would command softly, her eyes fixed entirely on the heart rate monitor, her hand tightly gripping Genevieve's small fingers. Inform her that the specialist warned against compounding the steroids until the next blood panel clears. Alaric would reply, standing rigidly on the opposite side of the bed, staring intently at the digital readouts. It was absolute torture. It was an emotional execution of the highest order. Yet, in its own tragic, devastating way, it was the most intimately natural they had been in weeks. They were a titan of industry, and a high society matriarch stripped of their billions, reduced simply to a mother and a father terrified of the dark. Their shared desperation was a gravity far stronger than the pride that had torn them apart. On the second night of her vigil near midnight, Eleanor stood to adjust the heavy thermal blanket. She had not slept since the phone call at Rosemont. 3 days of exhausting travel, emotional ruin, and unrelenting terror finally caught up to her in a single violent wave. Her knees buckled. Alaric was moving before she even began to fall. He caught her by the waist, his strong arm wrapping securely around her ribs, absorbing her weight entirely. For a fleeting, breathless second, she rested against him. Her forehead dropped to his shoulder, and he could feel the frantic, exhausted beating of her heart beneath the silk of her blouse. He reached out with his free hand, gently steadying her, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck. He wanted to pull her closer. He wanted to shield her from the terror of the room. Eleanor closed her eyes. A shudder ran through her entire body. She stayed there, wrapped in his arms for exactly 3 seconds. Then her eyes snapped open. The vulnerability vanished instantly, replaced by walls of impenetrable ice. She placed a hand flat against his chest and pushed herself upright with a shocking amount of force. She did not meet his gaze. She smoothed her blouse and stepped back, re-establishing the cold boundary between them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice terribly brittle and completely hollow. She walked back to the chair on her side of the bed, putting the mattress between them once more. Alaric stood there, his hands suddenly empty and cold, his chest aching with a phantom warmth he had violently thrown away and now had no right to claim. The true nightmare arrived at 3 in the morning. The fever spiked to its terrifying zenith. Genevieve became violently delirious. She thrashed beneath the sheets, tangling the IV lines, her tiny hands clawing at the air. She called out in fragmented, confused sobs, terrified of the medical equipment surrounding her. Eleanor sat on the left side of the mattress, desperately smoothing the child's damp hair, her tears finally falling hot and fast against the white linens. Alaric knelt on the right side, gripping his daughter's burning hand in his massive palms, silently begging whatever god was listening to take his empire, take his wealth, and take his life in exchange for hers. Suddenly Genevieve stopped thrashing, her breathing slowed to a painful wheeze. She opened her glassy, fever-bright eyes and stared directly across the bed at her father. Papa, the 5-year-old, rasped, her voice piercing the heavy hum of the medical machines. "Tell Mama you love her. Please. She is so sad." "Tell her." What followed was a silence unlike any Alaric had ever known. It was not the empty silence of the massive foyer after Eleanor left. It was the crushing, pressurized silence of a man standing at the edge of a monstrous cliff, staring down at a leap he did not know how to make. Alaric's mouth opened. The word was there. He could feel it lodged in his throat like a burning coal. He wanted to say it. He wanted to scream it into the vaulted ceilings of the estate so loudly that it would shatter the winter storms outside. But Alaric was a man bound by rigid, destructive definitions of truth. He could not say it now, not yet, because he knew with sickening clarity that if he spoke it at this exact moment, it would be a desperate lie told to comfort a dying child. Not a profound truth earned by a devoted husband. If he said it under the duress of his daughter's tears, he would taint the sacredness of the word forever. He would weaponize it for comfort, and Eleanor would know. He stared at his daughter's feverish face. His jaw worked, his chest heaved, but no sound came out. The great billionaire who commanded global markets with a single phone call was rendered completely pitifully mute. Eleanor watched his agonizing failure. A profound, devastating sorrow washed over her elegant features, extinguishing whatever faint, flickering hope might have miraculously survived in her chest. She placed her hand gently over Genevieve's eyes, shielding the child from the sight of her father's paralysis. "Sleep, my sweet girl," Eleanor whispered, her voice rich with unshed tears and an ironclad resolve. "Everything will be exactly as it should. Sleep now." Mercifully, the heavy medication finally took hold. The child's eyes closed, and by the grace of modern medicine, the fever finally broke at dawn. The unnatural heat left Genevieve's skin, and her ragged breathing smoothed into a steady, peaceful rhythm. The nightmare had passed, but the ruin it left behind in the room was absolute. The grey bruised light of the Manhattan winter spilled through the tall windows. Eleanor stood, her back aching, her clothes rumpled, and began to quietly gather her coat. She moved with the clinical detachment of a trauma surgeon abandoning a lost cause. Alaric followed her into the massive stone corridor. "She asked me to say it," Alaric said, his voice raw, leaning heavily against the cold marble wall. "Eleanor, I tried. I wanted to, but I could not say it falsely. Not to her. I could not lie to my daughter just to buy peace in that room." Eleanor stopped. She turned slowly in the grey light of the hallway. Her face was exhausted, stripped of all corporate artifice, leaving only the fierce, wounded, untouchable woman beneath the designer clothes. "I know you could not say it falsely, Alaric," she said, her voice eerily calm, devoid of any anger. "That is not what I am holding against you. Do you think I wanted you to lie?" He looked at her entirely confused, the desperation bleeding into his bloodshot eyes. "A word produced because a terrified child demanded it in a fever is not a word I can ever trust." Eleanor continued her tone, slicing through the cold air like a silver blade. "If you had spoken it last night, it would not have been your word. It would have been hers. You would have used our daughter's fear to excuse your own emotional cowardice." She pulled her heavy trench coat over her shoulders, tying the belt tightly around her waist. "I do not want your desperation, Alaric. I do not want your guilt. Come back to me when you have found your own reasons." She looked at him for one agonizing moment longer. Thank you for staying by her side. She needed her father. She turned and walked down the long corridor toward the helipad. He did not follow. He stood frozen in the cold hallway, listening to the heavy glass doors open and close, followed by the deafening roar of the helicopter engines spinning up. He went back into the medical wing, collapsed into the chair beside his sleeping daughter, and buried his face in his hands until the absolute failure of the night before calcified into a weight he could barely carry. For days afterward, the CEO of Valeris Holdings could not sleep. The master suite of the Winterbourne estate felt like a meticulously decorated crypt. He began to walk the sprawling grounds at night, driven by a restless, punishing energy. He avoided the corridors they had walked together. He avoided the executive study. Eventually, his wandering led him out into the freezing courtyard toward the massive domed structure of reinforced glass and steel that sat at the edge of the estate's private gardens. It was the botanical glasshouse. It was warm inside, the air thick with humidity and the rich, dark smell of damp earth. The winter garden was Eleanor's absolute sanctuary. She had personally designed the irrigation systems, imported the exotic soil, and curated the flora. It was a thriving, vibrant jungle of life in the middle of a frozen concrete wasteland. Alaric walked slowly down the central stone path, the ambient warmth a stark contrast to the ice in his veins. He looked at the lush green vines climbing the steel trellises, the vibrant winter roses blooming in the shadows. He realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that he had walked through this glass house 100 times over the years to summon her for corporate dinners or board meetings, but he had never once actually looked at what she was growing. He found the estate's chief horticulturalist, an elderly man named Dr. Thorne, pruning a massive bush of silver-leaf nightshade in the back quadrant. "Eleanor planted this section the week Genevieve was burned," Thorne said quietly, not looking up from his shears, as if the billionaire's presence at 3 a.m. was an entirely normal occurrence. "She told me she wanted something that could survive the harshest freeze. Something that would not die just because the sun went away." Alaric stared at the silver leaves. They were resilient, beautiful, and sharp, exactly like her. "What else did she plant?" Thorne Alaric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thorne pointed a calloused finger across the glass house. He began to list them. The weeping jasmine that bloomed only at dusk. The blue lotus imported from the southern deserts coaxed into life by Eleanor's relentless, meticulous care. The climbing maiden blush roses along the eastern glass. Alaric reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out his phone. He opened a blank digital notepad. "Tell me again," Alaric commanded softly. "Start from the beginning." He typed down every single name. He documented the soil conditions they required, the precise watering schedules, the way they reacted to the artificial UV light. He did not know what he intended to do with this botanical ledger, but as he stood in the humid, earthy dark surrounded by the living, breathing testament of his wife's devotion, Alaric finally understood the sheer magnitude of his crime. He had loved the beautiful, functioning garden she had built around him. He had bathed in its warmth and utilized its perfection to elevate his own status. But he had never, not once, bothered to learn the name of a single flower. 2 weeks later, the dead of winter momentarily broke, giving way to a crisp, blindingly bright Manhattan afternoon. Eleanor returned to the Winterbourne estate for the first time since the medical crisis. She had sent a brief, brutally practical email ahead of time, a message stripped of all pleasantries, dictating the exact hour of her arrival, to collect Genevieve for a month-long stay at Rosemont. She did not ask for an audience with Alaric. She did not expect one. While the security team loaded Genevieve's designer luggage into the waiting SUV, Eleanor walked the stone path bordering the estate's private lake. The vast body of water was frozen solid, gleaming like a polished silver mirror under the pale afternoon sun. The ancient willow trees at the far end were bare, their skeletal branches draped in frost. She walked slowly, the heavy hem of her emerald green cashmere coat sweeping over the dusted snow. She was making a final circuit in her mind, uncertain if she would ever walk these grounds again. Alaric found her standing at the wrought iron gate near the water's edge. He did not approach as a titan of industry demanding submission. He did not wear a custom suit. He wore a simple dark sweater and an overcoat, and he stopped 10 paces away, giving her the space of an adversary who had earned her wariness. He did not attempt to explain himself. He did not begin with a groveling apology or a complicated corporate justification. He looked at her tall, unbroken posture against the frozen lake, and he spoke the simplest truth he had left. "I've been sleeping in the Glasshouse," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the crisp air. Eleanor turned her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. She did not speak. "The master bedroom is wrong," Alaric continued, taking a slow step forward. "The boardroom is wrong. The study is wrong. The only part of this massive fortress that still feels like it possesses a living soul is the glass house. And that is because you built it. Your hands are in the soil. I can feel that you existed when I stand among the winter roses." He paused, his breath pluming in the cold air. "I have learned the names of every plant you cultivated," Thorne told me. "I wrote them all down." Eleanor's expression remained perfectly guarded. "You are the CEO of Valerius Holdings, Alaric. You should be memorizing international market trends, not the watering schedule of Blue Lotus." "I've spent weeks thinking about the answer I gave you in the study," he said, ignoring her deflection, his voice growing thicker. "I told you I did not love you because I was measuring my heart against my parents' madness. Their love was a wildfire. It consumed them both. I watched them burn their legacy to ash when I was a teenager. And I decided right then that love was a liability that destroys empires." He stepped closer, closing the distance until he was only an arm's length away. He looked down at her, his icy blue eyes stripped of all their usual arrogant armor, leaving only a desperate, profound clarity. "What I had with you was love, Eleanor," he said softly. "The quiet kind. The kind that builds empires instead of burning them down. It was so steady, so perfectly reliable, that I mistook it for the foundation of the house itself. I mistook you for the architecture. For 7 years. His voice finally broke, a raw, jagged sound. When the architecture left the house collapsed. Eleanor looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face. Her expression did not immediately soften into forgiveness, but he saw something profound shift within her dark eyes. It was the careful, measured acknowledgement of a woman recognizing a genuine surrender. "That is the first completely honest thing you have said to me in 7 years. She said, her voice devoid of malice, yet possessing the absolute hardness of a diamond. "But honesty, Alaric, is not enough to rebuild a ruined marriage." She turned slightly, her leather-gloved hand gripping the frozen iron of the gate. "You lived beside me in the most intimate proximity possible for 7 years. You tell me the company has fallen without me. You tell me you learned the names of my flowers. But you cannot sleep in a bed with a woman for 7 years and not know her soul. And I am entirely unconvinced that you know me at all." She let go of the gate and faced him fully. The challenge in her eyes was terrifying. "So prove it," she commanded softly. Tell me 3 things about Eleanor. Not the executive consultant who drafts your contracts. Not the mother who raises your heir. Not the quiet wife who managed your public relations and smoothed your corporate blunders. Tell me 3 things about me. Alaric breathed out. I can do that. Then do it. He searched his mind frantically, tearing through 7 years of memories, trying to isolate the woman from the role she played. You manage the philanthropic treasuries with a precision that outmatches my CFO. That is the executive consultant. Eleanor interrupted, her voice exact, not unkind, just ruthlessly accurate. You are relentlessly patient with Genevieve when she refuses her tutors. That is a mother, she said. Alaric stopped. He stood on the frozen path, the afternoon light gleaming off the snow, and he looked at the woman he had married. He looked at her sharp jawline, her dark piercing eyes, the way she held her shoulders. He searched the vast archives of his genius mind, and to his absolute horror, he could not find her. He could find the partner. He could find the mother. He could find the diplomat. He could not find Eleanor, the woman standing separate and entire on her own ground. Eleanor watched him fail. She watched the realization drain the color from his face. She did not mock him. The profound sadness that passed over her features was far worse than anger. You do not know me, Alaric. She whispered the wind, carrying the words away as soon as they left her lips. You loved what I provided for you, not who I am. You loved the architecture, but you never once bothered to ask what the architecture dreamed of. She stepped past him on the path, the heavy cashmere of her coat brushing against his frozen hands. Come back when you can answer the question, she said, not looking back. 3 things about me. I will be at Rosemont. She walked away, leaving the billionaire standing alone by the frozen lake, clutching a question he was terrified he might never be able to answer. It was during the deep, bitter freeze of mid-February that the first whisper of the poison reached the 50th floor of the Valerius Tower. A billionaire CEO is rarely the first to hear the gossip of his own social circle, insulated as he is by layers of sycophants, public relations managers, and elite security details. But eventually a lie grows too large, too malicious to hide in the shadows of the exclusive country clubs and high society charity galas. It arrived in the form of Richard Harrington, a wealthy venture capitalist from a rival firm who had traveled to Manhattan to negotiate a highly lucrative tech merger. They were seated in Alaric's private office, the heavy glass table between them scattered with financial projections, when Harrington, with the careful, calculated casualness of a man probing for weakness, mentioned the unfortunate domestic scandal. Alaric paused, his silver pen hovering over the signature line of the massive contract. Explain yourself, Harrington. Harrington cleared his throat, leaning forward in the custom leather chair, completely misreading the deadly stillness in the room as an invitation for old boys club camaraderie. The circulating account, Alaric, the whispers sweeping through the Hamptons and the Upper East Side, is that Eleanor was dismissed from the estate under the shadow of a severe breach of contract, a discovery of marital infidelity, a betrayal of the vows. The temperature in the executive office seemed to plummet 30 degrees in a single second. Alaric did not shout. He did not throw his pen. He set it down with a sharp click that sounded like a snapping bone in the quiet room. In a dynasty where public perception dictated stock prices and legacy was everything, infidelity in a matriarch was not a mere tabloid scandal. It was corporate treason. It was a social death sentence designed to strip a woman of her standing, her dignity, and her untouchable power. Who is the architect of this lie? Alaric asked. His voice was terrifyingly soft, a velvet scabbard sliding off a razor-sharp blade. It is everywhere. Alaric Harrington stammered the color rapidly, draining from his face as he realized his fatal miscalculation. It has been circulating for nearly a month. I only thought as partners we should address the optics before the shareholders' meeting. You thought to test the waters, Alaric said slowly, standing up. His massive frame shadowed the venture capitalist, completely blocking the sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows. You will walk out of my building within the next 60 seconds. I am pulling Valerius Capital from your tech merger. I am freezing our joint assets. And if I ever hear my wife's name on your tongue again, I will personally ensure your firm is liquidated and sold for scraps before the end of the fiscal quarter. He dismissed the trembling executive and immediately summoned Sterling and his head of crisis management. Within 3 hours, the public relations team confirmed a horrifying truth. The rumor had saturated the entire elite social registry. And worse, Eleanor had been given a dozen opportunities by visiting socialites and board members at the Rosemont estate to categorically deny it to strike the rumor down with her own formidable authority. Every single time the matter was raised in her presence, she had politely, firmly changed the subject. She had refused to confirm or deny. Alaric paced his dark study at the Winterbourne estate that night, the fire dying in the massive stone hearth. Why? Eleanor was a fiercely proud woman. Her honor was impeccable. She had built her entire reputation on flawless integrity. Why would she allow the high society vultures to drag her name through the mud? Why would she permit the board of directors to believe she was a traitor to the dynasty? He stopped by the tall window, looking out at the frozen courtyard. And then somewhere in the freezing dark, the devastating realization struck him. It hit him with the force of a physical blow to the chest, driving the breath entirely from his lungs. To correct the rumor, Eleanor would have to tell the truth. To clear her own name, she would be forced to stand before the elite families of Manhattan and speak his words aloud. She would have to look the press in the eye and say, "My husband told me he never loved me and so I left." She would have to put his cruel, humiliating sentence into the mouths of every gossip columnist in the city. She would have to expose the pathetic, broken emotional reality of the untouchable CEO to the entire world. She was enduring a social execution. She was allowing a lie that touched her pride in the most severe way possible, simply to avoid speaking his painful words aloud again. Even in exile, even after he had broken her heart, she was still protecting his public image. She was absorbing the devastating cost of his arrogance exactly as she had absorbed every other burden quietly and without demanding thanks for 7 years. Alaric did not sleep that night. He did not go to the Glasshouse to study his botanical ledger. He went to his mahogany desk, opened his encrypted laptop, and began to type. He did not delegate this task to his public relations team. He did not let the legal department draft a sanitized, ambiguous corporate statement. He wrote the press release himself, his keystrokes sharp and forceful in the silent room. He drafted a direct, unsparing letter and ordered his media team to distribute it to every major financial publication, society, paper, and board member in the country by sunrise. He named himself as the sole architect of the marital separation. He stated plainly, under the absolute authority of his position as CEO, that Eleanor Valerius's character, honor, and loyalty were flawless and entirely above reproach. He confessed to grievous personal failings, emotional blindness, and extreme arrogance that had driven his wife away. He publicly stripped himself of his untouchable armor. He decreed that any media outlet executive or socialite caught speaking ill of her would face the full, unmitigated wrath of Valerius Holdings. He attached the immediate termination of Richard Harrington's contracts as a bloody warning to the rest of the elite circle. He hit send as the sun rose over the Manhattan skyline, his eyes burning with exhaustion. He did not send a private copy to Eleanor. He did not do this to win points in some twisted corporate negotiation. He did it because he was finally learning how to protect his wife, even if he was no longer allowed to stand beside her. By noon, the financial world was in a state of absolute shock. The statement was unprecedented. Titans of industry did not publicly humiliate themselves. They did not admit fault. They bought silence with ironclad non-disclosure agreements and millions of dollars. But Alaric had essentially walked into the public square and set his own ego on fire to keep Eleanor warm. 2 days later, Sterling walked into Alaric's office. The older man held a printed copy of a major financial journal, the front page dominated by the fallout of Alaric's confession. "The board is panicking," Sterling said, dropping the paper onto the glass desk. "The stock dipped 4% this morning. They think you are losing your edge. They think you're becoming unstable." "Let them panic," Alaric said, not looking up from his laptop. "Let the stock dip. I will rebuild the capital. I have rebuilt from worse." Sterling watched him for a long moment, the tight lines of his aged face softening just a fraction. "You burned your own reputation to the ground to clear hers. You handed your enemies a loaded weapon." "My reputation was built on a lie," Alaric replied quietly, closing the laptop. "I let the world think I was a self-made god when in reality, I was standing on her shoulders for 7 years. It is time the market corrected itself." "And what if she still does not return?" Sterling asked. "What if you gave up your pride for absolutely nothing?" Then she will live her life knowing the truth is documented, Alaric said, looking at his oldest confidant with a terrifyingly calm resolve. She asked me for 3 things about her soul. I am still searching for them. Until I find them, my pride is entirely irrelevant. The public exposure of his own cruelty was merely the first step. Alaric had finally realized that to win back a queen who had walked away from an empire, he could not simply offer her the throne again. He had to prove he was willing to burn it all down just to see her clearly. 5 weeks after the confrontation by the frozen lake, on a bitterly cold Thursday afternoon in late March, Alaric stood before the heavy oak doors of the Rosemont estate and knocked. He had not called ahead. He had not sent an envoy. He stood on the massive stone porch with the winter wind whipping his dark overcoat, entirely stripped of his corporate leverage. He was no longer the ruthless CEO of Valerius Holdings demanding an audience. He was a starving man who had finally found the map to the only sanctuary that could save him. Eleanor opened the door herself. She wore a simple, unadorned grey cashmere dress, the fabric falling elegantly around her tall frame. She looked at him, her pale hand resting lightly on the heavy iron doorframe. He could see the tragic guarded look in her dark eyes. She had meticulously trained herself not to hope, because expecting him to understand her soul had already cost her too much blood. She was a fortress of ice, completely untouchable. Alaric did not offer a formal greeting. He did not step inside. He stood in the falling snow and spoke. "You read the final penalty clause of every contract first," he said, his voice cutting through the winter wind, steady and absolute. "I noticed it in our 2nd year of marriage. You would take the 50-page legal documents, completely ignore the grand titles and the lucrative projections, and flip immediately to the back to read the consequences of a breach. I thought it was just the cautious habit of a corporate consultant." Eleanor's hand tightened imperceptibly on the doorframe. Her posture went entirely rigid. "But you told me once," Alaric continued, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to the threshold. "We were in the corporate archives, late at night. You told me it was because your father lost the entire Eastern subsidiary because he trusted the beautiful preamble of a merger and failed to read the hidden termination clause at the bottom. The betrayal ruined his legacy and the stress killed him a year later. You swore on his grave you would never be blind to how a pact ends. You have read the last page of every document first ever since because you are terrified of being destroyed by what you do not see." Eleanor did not move. The wind howled around the stone turrets above them, but the silence between them was deafening. "You are utterly terrified of deep water," Alaric said, his voice dropping, carrying the immense weight of a sacred confession. "You have been afraid of the ocean since before I ever put a wedding ring on your finger. I do not know what happened. You never told me, and I was too arrogant, too obsessed with my own empire to ever ask. And that is a foundational failure I will carry to my grave. But you board the corporate yacht every single summer." He looked directly into her eyes, breaking through the matriarch's armor, speaking directly to the shattered woman beneath. "Every July without fail you walk up the gangplank. You stand on the deck as we sail for the Hamptons. And I finally know why. Because Genevieve told me when she was 4 years old. She said, 'Mama holds my hand on the boat because she loves the water. But you do not. You grip the polished wooden rails until your knuckles are entirely white. You endure absolute suffocating terror for weeks at a time because your daughter loves the ocean and you decided her joy was worth far more than your fear. You ride out into the dark water, terrified, and you have never let our daughter see it once." He paused. The air in the doorway was thick, heavy, with the undeniable gravity of a man who had finally opened his eyes. "And you hum," Alaric whispered. He stepped up into the doorway, moving out of the snow, entering her protective space. "I told you weeks ago that you hum when you arranged the winter roses, and you told me I was wrong, and you were absolutely right. I went back to an empty estate and I thought about when I had actually heard that melody, when I had truly been present in the room with you. It is not when you are anxious. It is when Genevieve is finally asleep, when the security detail has retired, when the massive house is dead quiet, and you think absolutely no one in the world can hear you." Eleanor's breath hitched violently. A single hot tear broke free, tracking fast down her pale cheek. "You are always doing something small," Alaric said, his voice breaking, tears shining in his own icy blue eyes. folding a ribbon or standing by the high glass window looking out at the city lights. You hum the exact same ancient melody every time. I do not know its name. I've never known its name, but I've heard it, echoing in my head every single night for the past 3 months. Every night since you abandoned the estate, and I only just now understood what it was. He reached out his bare hand, trembling as his fingers gently brushed the tear from her jawline. It was the sound of you being happy. What followed was a stillness unlike any that had ever existed in the Valerius dynasty. It was not the suffocating silence of an empty boardroom, nor the breathless tension of a hostile negotiation. It was the devastating, beautiful stillness of something precious buried beneath 7 years of ice and duty finally breaking the surface to breathe. Eleanor stood in the doorway of Rosemont, and she did not speak for a long, agonizing moment. Alaric waited. He waited because he had learned in the freezing dark of the glass house, and the crushing loneliness of his own bed, that waiting for her was an honor, not a chore. The melody is an old French lullaby my mother sang, Eleanor whispered at last, her voice incredibly fragile, stripped of all its corporate iron. She sang it when she was walking in the summer gardens, before my father lost the company. I did not know I hummed it aloud. I did not know anyone had ever heard it. I heard it, Eleanor, Alaric said, his chest heaving. I heard it for 7 years. I was just too great a fool to understand the value of what I was hearing. But I do now. He met her gaze steadily. A titan of industry offering his absolute, unconditional surrender. Now I do. She looked at him. She looked at the deep exhaustion etched into his aristocratic features, the genuine raw truth bleeding from his posture. He had burned his own reputation to the ground to protect hers. He had dismantled his ego to learn her soul. Slowly, she stepped back from the doorframe. It was not a grand, dramatic invitation. It was simply the offering of space. A space he could choose to step into or walk away from. Alaric did not hesitate. He crossed the threshold. Eleanor closed the heavy oak door behind them, shutting out the winter storm, leaving them both on the same side of the fortress walls. Deep winter eventually loosened its death grip on Manhattan. By early April, the frost had melted from the sprawling lawns of the Winterborn estate. On a Tuesday morning, the heavy glass doors of the Valerius Holdings executive boardroom on the 50th floor swung open. The room was packed with the elite board of directors, men and women, who had spent the last 3 months whispering about the fall of the dynasty. The room immediately fell into a dead, terrified silence. Eleanor walked in first. She wore a razor-sharp black designer suit, her dark hair pinned flawlessly back, a breathtaking diamond necklace resting at her throat. The click of her stilettos against the polished floor sounded like a judge's gavel. She radiated a devastating, absolute cold elegance. She was not the quiet wife returning to her husband's shadow. She was the untouchable queen returning to claim the empire she had built. Alaric walked in half a step behind her. The billionaire CEO, the most feared man in the financial district, did not look at the board. His eyes were entirely fixed on his wife, his posture radiating a fierce, protective deference. He pulled out the custom leather chair at the absolute head of the massive mahogany table. Eleanor sat down. She did not look at the files. She folded her manicured hands on the table and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every single executive who had dared to doubt her. They practically stopped breathing. Alaric took the seat to her immediate right. The king had officially handed over the crown. Eleanor tapped her diamond ring once against the mahogany wood. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Let us review the termination clauses, gentlemen," Eleanor said, her voice smooth, lethal, and perfectly calm. "I hear there have been some misunderstandings in my absence." She did not smile. She did not need to. The woman they broke had returned, and she was entirely untouchable.